There is a house in Jamaica. It sits on a hill above the Caribbean, gleaming in the tropical sun. Rose Hall, a great Georgian mansion of cut stone and mahogany, a perfect jewel of colonial architecture. But tourists don't come for the beauty. They come for Jamaica's darkest legend. They come for the woman whose ghost is said to still walk these halls. Her name is Annie Palmer, the White Witch of Rose Hall. The legend, they tell you, is a perfect Gothic horror, a tale of a cruel and beautiful mistress who practiced voodoo, murdered 3 husbands, and tortured her enslaved workers in a secret dungeon beneath the house. The first husband, they say, was poisoned, the second stabbed, the third strangled in his own bed. Her cruelty was matched only by her appetite. She took enslaved men from the fields as her lovers, and when she tired of them, their bodies disappeared. This is the story of a monster in silk whose reign of terror seemed absolute. It only ended when she was finally strangled in her sleep, her black magic unable to save her. The mansion today stands as a monument to her evil, and the guides whisper that if you stand in the grand ballroom at midnight, you can still hear her footsteps, still feel her eyes watching you from the shadows. This is the story everyone knows, but it leads to a much deeper, darker question. What if the murders, the voodoo, and the ghost are not the most terrifying secret these walls are hiding? The cold, calculating, and entirely rational business of turning human beings into sugar. That is the true, unforgivable crime of Rose Hall, but that truth is quiet and methodical. It lives in dusty archives and dry-as-bone accounting ledgers. The truth doesn't sell tickets to a ghost tour. So they sell you a better story, a story with a face, a story with a villain you can hate, a monster you can fear, a ghost you can hunt in the dark corridors after the sun goes down. They give you Annie Palmer, the White Witch. The legend is a masterpiece of Gothic horror, a tale so perfectly constructed it feels ancient, inevitable. She arrives at Rose Hall, a beautiful, mysterious bride, her soul already darkened, they say, by a childhood in Haiti, where she was tutored in the black arts of voodoo. One by one her husbands die. The first is poisoned, the second stabbed, the third strangled. Her cruelty is matched only by her appetite. She takes enslaved men from the fields as her lovers, and when she tires of them, they are murdered and disappear, their bodies cast into the unmarked graves of the plantation. They tell you of the secret dungeons beneath the great house, of the torture devices and the bear traps she used to hunt runaway slaves. They whisper of the screams that echoed through the stone passages. She was not just a slave owner, she was a sadist, a monster who ruled through black magic and personal terror. It is a story that has everything. A villainess who is both seductive and diabolical. A lonely, haunted mansion filled with secret passages. A final, violent climax where the enslaved people rise up in rebellion and finally kill their tormentor, ending her reign of blood. It is a perfect horror story, and that is its first and its greatest flaw, because history is never perfect. It is messy, contradictory, and filled with inconvenient facts that ruin a good story. And the documented facts of the real Annie Palmer's life simply do not fit the legend. Our investigation began not in the haunted hallways of Rose Hall, but in the silent, sterile archives of Jamaica. We looked for the evidence, the coroner's reports on the murdered husbands, the plantation records detailing this reign of supernatural terror, the contemporary accounts of this demonic mistress, and we found nothing. The real Annie Palmer was the mistress of Rose Hall for a little over a decade. She had one husband who died of yellow fever. According to the records, she herself died peacefully in 1831, years before the Great Slave Rebellion that supposedly claimed her life. So where did the White Witch come from? The bloodthirsty, voodoo-practicing, husband-killing monster? She was born in 1929. She is not a historical figure. She is a literary character. She was brought to life in the pages of a novel, The White Witch of Rose Hall, by a Jamaican journalist named Herbert G. de Lissa. De Lissa, a master storyteller, took a few vague local rumors and forged them into a sensational masterpiece of fiction. He created a monster, and in doing so, he performed a great and terrible service for the memory of the entire planter class. He gave them a scapegoat. Think of the genius of this invention. The legend takes the documented, systemic and widespread brutality of hundreds of sugar plantations, a brutality practiced by thousands of male planters, overseers, and bookkeepers for over a century, and it concentrates all of that evil into one single, exceptional female figure. She becomes a lightning rod for all the horror. Her evil is personal, passionate, supernatural. It is therefore not the logical, predictable and soul-crushingly banal evil of a business model. And that is the parallel story, the one the ghost tour must forget. The real story of Rose Hall is not about one monstrous woman. It is about a monstrous system. The real villain is not a witch with a vial of poison. It is the ledger book, the crisp, clean pages that record tons of sugar produced, gallons of rum distilled, and the purchase price of a human being. The ledger is a villain without motive, without passion. It feels no hate, only the cold, rational imperative of profit. The ledger demanded that human beings be worked to death during crop time, because buying new ones from the latest slave ship was cheaper than letting them live to an old age. It demanded terror and the public flogging, not out of sadism, but because they were the most efficient tools of production. The horror of Rose Hall was not an aberration of one woman's cruelty. It was the standard operating procedure of an entire industry. And the White Witch is the beautiful, terrifying ghost that was invented to stand guard over that simple, unforgivable truth. But a truth that vast cannot be guarded by a ghost alone. Long before the legend was invented, the first line of defense was built into the earth. The location itself was the first and most powerful weapon. The choice of where to build was not a matter of taste. It was a cold, strategic calculation. So we must ask, why here? Why this particular corner of Jamaica? The answer is not in the beauty of the turquoise sea or the gentle trade winds. The answer is in the business of sugar. The parish of St. James, with its port at Montego Bay, was the epicenter of Jamaica's sugar empire. It was the Silicon Valley of the 18th century sugar boom. The land was fertile, a rich soil that could sustain the hungry, nutrient-leaching cane. The climate was a relentless, year-round furnace, perfect for cultivating the crop. And most critically, it had the port. Montego Bay was the gateway to the Atlantic. It was from here that the hogsheads of white gold and the puncheons of rum were shipped to the ravenous markets of Britain and North America. This location wasn't chosen for its charm. It was chosen for its brutal efficiency. But the macro location is only the first part of the strategy. Zoom in closer. Look at where the great house itself is placed. It is not nestled in a valley or set back from the shore. It is built on high ground, a dominant position on a hillside. The tourist brochures will tell you this was for the view, a romantic notion. The master of the house, sipping his rum on the veranda, enjoying the spectacular panorama of his domain. That is a lie. The view was not for pleasure. It was for control. The Rose Hall Great House was designed as a panopticon, a watchtower at the heart of an open-air prison. From its elevated verandas, The master or his overseer had an unbroken line of sight over the entire operation. He could see the enslaved gangs cutting cane in the fields. He could see the smoke rising from the boiling house of the sugar works. He could see the layout of the slave village below. There was nowhere to hide. The house was a constant architectural reminder of the master's inescapable gaze. It was a tool of psychological warfare. The knowledge that you were always being watched, that the great house was always looming over you, was as powerful a deterrent as any whip. This was a deliberate act of spatial segregation. The hill created two separate worlds. The world of the European elite, floating above in their Georgian palace, a world of manicured lawns and cool breezes, and below, the world of the African workforce, a world of sweat, smoke, and industrial hell. The choice of location was not an afterthought. It was the blueprint for the entire system of control. The very ground on which the house was built was engineered to be the first and most inescapable prison wall. The very ground on which the house was built was engineered to be the first and most inescapable prison wall. But a prison built on such a monstrous crime requires a justification. It needs a story. And this brings us to the central mystery of our investigation. The crucial question is not, and has never been, was Annie Palmer a real witch? To ask that is to fall into the very trap the story sets for you. It is a distraction, a sideshow. The real mystery, the one that uncovers the entire conspiracy of memory, is this: why was the White Witch myth created? And more importantly, why does it persist with such ferocious, profitable energy? To answer this, we must first understand the motivation of the people who actually built Rose Hall. Let us forget the fictional Annie Palmer for a moment and look at the real historical figures, John Palmer and his first wife Rosa. What drove them? It was not sadism or black magic. It was a single, all-consuming, and entirely rational ambition, the relentless pursuit of profit. Sugar in the 18th century was the oil of its day. It was a commodity of immense value, capable of creating staggering fortunes almost overnight. But it was also a high-risk game. The planters faced the constant threat of drought, of hurricanes, of fires in the cane fields, of equipment failure in the sugar works. And above all, they faced the constant, simmering threat of rebellion from the enslaved population that vastly outnumbered them. This combination of immense greed and immense fear was the psychological engine that drove the entire planter class. Their ambition was to extract the maximum amount of sugar from the land and from human bodies in the shortest possible time. Their fear was that this brutal system could collapse at any moment. This is the banal, ugly, and historically accurate motivation behind the construction of Rose Hall. It was a machine for making money, built by men terrified of losing it. But this truth, a truth of systematic, profit-driven cruelty, is uncomfortable. It is indicting. It implicates not just one family, but an entire class, an entire economic system, an entire empire, and it is, frankly, not very entertaining. And this is where the genius of the White Witch myth comes in. This is the motivation behind its creation and its persistence. The legend is a commercial and psychological masterstroke. It performs a brilliant act of historical alchemy. First, it creates a sensational, marketable product. Ghosts sell, witches sell, gothic horror sells. A tour that promises a supernatural thrill is infinitely more appealing to the average tourist than a somber historical lecture on the economics of chattel slavery. The myth transformed a site of historical atrocity into a haunted house attraction, a profitable piece of entertainment. Second, and far more insidiously, it obscures the more terrible and widespread truth. The legend acts as a scapegoat. It takes the collective guilt of the entire planter class and projects it onto a single, exceptional figure. Annie Palmer becomes the monster, allowing every other planter, every other overseer, every other investor in the sugar trade to seem normal, even benign by comparison. The myth replaces the mundane, systemic evil of 1,000 ledger books with the extraordinary, theatrical evil of one woman. Her crimes are passionate, personal, even supernatural. The real crimes of the plantation system were impersonal, rational, and driven by market forces. By making the evil extraordinary, the myth makes the ordinary evil invisible. This is why it persists. It makes the unbearable history of slavery palatable. It allows tourists to experience a shiver of fear without the disquieting burden of historical guilt. It allows the modern inheritors of this legacy, the tour companies, the resort owners, the entire tourism infrastructure, to profit from the site without having to truly confront the crime it was built on. The central mystery is not about a ghost. It is about the deliberate manufacturing of a ghost to stand in for a truth too terrible and too unprofitable to tell. The White Witch is not the villain of the story. She is the ghost in the machine, the beautiful lie that keeps the real, ugly engine of history hidden from view. The White Witch is not the villain of the story. She is the ghost in the machine, the beautiful lie that keeps the real, ugly engine of history hidden from view. And long before that lie was ever spoken, the first layer of deception was laid in stone. To understand the original message of Rose Hall, the message it broadcast for a century before it needed a ghost, you must look at its exterior. You must read the argument it makes with its very form. The style is known as Jamaican Georgian, but we must be precise. There is nothing inherently Jamaican about it. This is the architecture of Britain, a style developed for a cool, damp island in the North Atlantic, lifted wholesale and dropped onto a tropical island in the Caribbean. This act of transplantation was, in itself, a statement of intent. Look at the structure. It is a monument to order, symmetry, and control, a perfect 3-story block of cut stone, its windows arranged in a flawless, repeating grid. The roof is a heavy, hipped form, designed to convey stability. The entrance is the centerpiece, a grand, formal staircase of stone, leading up to a majestic doorway flanked by columns. Everything is balanced, rational, predictable. This is the architectural language of the Enlightenment, of an age that believed in reason, order, and the power of a logical system to tame the world. The materials themselves reinforce this message. The foundation and walls are made of solid, locally quarried stone, giving the house a sense of immense weight and permanence. It looks less like a home and more like a fortress. And this is no accident. The exterior of Rose Hall was a piece of cultural and psychological warfare. In the eyes of the British planter class, Jamaica was a place of chaos. The untamed, suffocating jungle, the unpredictable and violent weather, and most terrifyingly, the overwhelming presence of the enslaved African population. All of this represented a threat to the fragile European order. The Great House was the answer to that threat. Its rigid, classical symmetry was a direct rebuke to the supposed chaos of the tropics. Its formal, balanced facade was meant to project an aura of unshakable British rationality. It was an argument made in stone that civilization had arrived and was in control. It was a declaration of permanence. In an environment where disease, hurricanes, and rebellion could wipe out a fortune and a family in an instant, this house was designed to look as if it would stand for 1,000 years. It was an attempt to impose a sense of English stability on a profoundly unstable world. But there is a deeper, more brutal message here. This grand, elevated structure, with its imposing staircase, was designed to be seen from below, from the perspective of the fields. From that vantage point, it was not a home. It was the citadel of the master. The massive stone base, the elevated main floor, it communicated power, separation, and unbridgeable distance. The exterior of Rose Hall was not an invitation. It was a warning. It was a physical manifestation of the colonial power structure, a declaration that this small piece of the island was, and would remain, forever England. It was a fortress of civility, built on a foundation of fear and designed to broadcast a single, unambiguous message to all who saw it. We are the masters here. It was a fortress of civility, built on a foundation of fear and designed to broadcast a single, unambiguous message to all who saw it. We are the masters here. But once you passed through the grand entrance, leaving the world of the fields and the works behind, the message changed. The raw, intimidating power of the exterior was replaced by a performance of refined elegance. The interior of the great house was not a home, it was a theater, and the play it performed every single day was a fantasy of aristocratic English life. This was a machine built to enforce a brutal social and racial hierarchy, but to do so with the quiet, effortless grace of high society. The entire main floor was the stage for this performance. Here you found the public rooms, the grand ballroom with its soaring ceiling and glittering chandeliers, the formal dining room that could seat dozens, the elegant parlors for cards and conversation. Every detail was designed to display wealth and to replicate the lifestyle of the British gentry thousands of miles away. The furniture was not local, it was imported mahogany, exquisitely carved in the latest London fashion. The tableware was not pottery, it was fine china and heavy English silver. The portraits on the walls were of stern-faced ancestors, establishing a lineage, a claim to legitimacy. This was a spectacle of conspicuous consumption, a constant reinforcement that the owners were not mere colonial farmers, but members of a superior ruling class. The upper floor was the private domain of the master's family, a sanctuary of whiteness separated from the labor below. But the entire illusion, this entire performance of civilized leisure, was utterly dependent on a vast, unseen machinery of human labor. And the genius of the interior's design was its ability to make this labor disappear. The house was built with two circulatory systems. There was the grand, visible system for the masters, the sweeping, polished mahogany staircase that dominated the entrance hall, the wide, airy corridors connecting the public rooms. This was for whites only. And then there was the hidden system, the one for the enslaved, a network of narrow back stairs, hidden passages, and service doors. This was the circulatory system of the house's true engine. It was designed so that the enslaved domestic staff, the cooks, the cleaners, the valets, the maids, could move through the house like ghosts. They were meant to be invisible, silent presences, emerging from a hidden door to serve a meal, clear a plate, or light a candle, and then melting back into the shadows of the house. Every element of the aristocratic performance was made possible by this invisible workforce. The gleaming, polished floors were the result of hours of back-breaking labor. The elaborate multi-course dinners appeared as if by magic from the kitchens, which were located in a separate building to keep the heat and the unpleasant smells away from the main house. The starched white linens, the perfectly made beds, the spotless crystal, all were the products of a coerced, invisible army. The interior of Rose Hall was the ultimate expression of the master-slave relationship. It was a space engineered to allow a handful of people to live in a state of perpetual, performed leisure, while dozens of others were forced to labor invisibly to maintain the illusion. It was a stage where the actors could pretend they were aristocrats, and the price of admission was the complete erasure of the humanity of the stagehands. It was a stage where the actors could pretend they were aristocrats, and the price of admission was the complete erasure of the humanity of the stagehands. But this erasure was not confined to the walls of the great house. To truly control a population, you must first conquer and control their environment. The entire Rose Hall estate, stretching for thousands of acres, was not a farm. It was a battlefield. It was the site of a relentless, generations-long war waged against nature itself. The original landscape of this part of Jamaica was a complex, diverse ecosystem of native forests and vegetation. To the sugar planter, this was not a world to be understood. It was a wilderness to be annihilated. The first act of control was the clear-cut. An army of enslaved people, armed with axes and machetes, was forced to tear down the native world, tree by tree. And in its place, they planted a desert. Not a desert of sand, but a biological desert of a single species, sugarcane. This was an agricultural monoculture, an alien system imposed on the land for one purpose and one purpose only: maximum efficiency. The cane was planted in vast geometric grids, a living graph paper of profit. This was not farming, it was industrial extraction. The cane was a hungry crop, and this system of cultivation exhausted the soil, stripping it of nutrients. The land became dependent, addicted to the planter's inputs, unable to sustain itself. The natural world was broken, tamed, and forced into a state of total submission. It was a mirror of the human system, an environment enslaved, just like the people who worked it. This control extended beyond the fields into a purpose-built industrial zone. This was the heart of the operation, the place where the raw cane was transformed into wealth. This was the sugar works. It was a factory in a field, a vision of hell dropped into the tropical landscape. It was a complex of specialized buildings, each a station in a brutal production line. First, the mill, a terrifying machine of massive stone rollers powered by cattle or a water wheel. Here, the cane was fed into the crushers, a task where a moment's inattention could lead to a hand or an arm being torn from its socket. From the mill, the extracted juice flowed into the boiling house. This was the furnace, a long shed open to the elements, filled with a sequence of massive copper kettles known as the Jamaica train. Here, enslaved boilermakers worked in unbearable heat and choking smoke, skimming impurities from the scalding liquid as it was heated to precise temperatures. Severe burns were a constant, daily reality. Next, the curing house, a cavernous space where the thick, boiled syrup was left in huge, conical pots, allowing the molasses to drain away and the raw muscovado sugar to crystallize. And finally, the distillery, where that molasses, the byproduct of sugar, was fermented and distilled into rum, another vital stream of revenue. This entire complex imposed a relentless industrial rhythm on the agricultural landscape. It was a machine that never slept during harvest time. The clank of the mill, the roar of the furnaces, the shouts of the overseers, this was the soundtrack to a system of total environmental and human control. Nature had been subdued, and the land itself had been re-engineered into a vast, open-air factory for producing white gold. Nature had been subdued, and the land itself had been re-engineered into a vast, open-air factory for producing white gold. But this factory supported two entirely separate, parallel worlds. To understand Rose Hall at its zenith in the late 18th century, you must understand that life was lived according to two different calendars, two different clocks, two different realities that existed on the same patch of earth but never truly touched. The first was the calendar of the planter class. This was the world of the great house. Life for the white owners was a frantic, almost desperate performance of aristocratic English leisure. Their social calendar was the engine of their power. It was a relentless cycle of lavish dinners, formal balls that lasted until dawn, and elaborate multi-day parties. These were not mere social gatherings. They were rituals of conspicuous consumption designed to display wealth and solidify power. A planter's worth was measured by the quality of his imported wine, the number of courses served at his table, the fineness of his wife's silk gown. These events were where business was done, where alliances between the powerful planter families were cemented through marriage, where political strategies were formed. The great house was the stage, and the performance was designed to prove that they were not brutal colonial industrialists, but a landed, civilized gentry. This calendar was marked by leisure, by excess, and by a carefully constructed insulation from the source of the wealth that paid for it all. The planters could admire their fields from the veranda, but they never felt the sting of the cane leaf on their skin. They savored the sweetness of the sugar in their tea, but they never felt the searing heat of the boiling house. And then there was the second calendar, the calendar of the enslaved. This was the world of the fields and the sugar works. For the 2,000 or so human beings owned by the Rose Hall estate, life was not measured by social seasons, but by the brutal, unyielding demands of the crop. The year was divided into two. The dead season, the time of planting and cultivation, was a period of grueling agricultural labor under the tropical sun. But the true heart of their calendar, the period that defined their existence, was crop time, the harvest. During crop time, the entire plantation became a war zone, and the factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, often for months on end. The routine for the enslaved was dictated by the unceasing rhythm of the machine. They were organized into shifts, working brutal 12 to 18-hour stretches without a break. There was no day or night, only the relentless demand of the cane. Gangs worked through the night in the fields by firelight, cutting the cane, which had to be sent to the mill within hours before the sugar content began to decline. At the works, the shifts were even more hellish. People were fed into the maw of the industrial process, facing the constant threat of dismemberment in the crushing rollers or horrific burns from the scalding cauldrons of sugar. Sleep was a luxury. Exhaustion was a constant state. Death was an industrial accident. This was the daily operational reality, a stark, unbridgeable conflict between the enforced, performative leisure of the few and the enforced, industrial hell of the many. The laughter from the ballroom of the great house was a sound from another planet, a world away from the screams and the groans that echoed from the factory floor just down the hill. Two calendars, two realities, one single, brutal truth. The leisure of the first was paid for, minute by minute, by the agony of the second. Two calendars, two realities, one single, brutal truth. The leisure of the first was paid for, minute by minute, by the agony of the second. And that agony was not a byproduct of the system. It was the system. The beautiful, crystallized sugar that graced the tea tables of Europe was not a natural product. It was the end result of a violent industrial process of alchemy, one that transformed green cane and black bodies into white gold. This was the dirty engine. The process was a relentless race against time, a series of brutal steps, each one powered by human muscle and calibrated by human pain. It began in the fields. The cane, once ripe, had to be harvested with brutal speed. Gangs of enslaved men and women worked with heavy, razor-sharp machetes, cutting the thick stalks in the suffocating heat. The work was punishing, the pace frantic. From the moment it was cut, the cane began to die. Its sugar content would degrade with every passing hour, so it was rushed to the mill. Here, at the terrifying heart of the machine, the cane was fed by hand into the massive, grinding rollers. These mills were unforgiving. A moment of exhaustion, a slip, a snagged piece of clothing, and a hand or arm would be pulled in, crushed to a pulp. An axe was often kept nearby, not for repairs, but for amputation, the only way to save a person from being pulled entirely into the machine. The raw juice, now extracted, was channeled into the boiling house. This was the furnace. The juice was poured into the first of a series of copper cauldrons, the Jamaica train, and heated over open fires. Enslaved boilermakers, the most skilled workers in the factory, had to perform a delicate, dangerous ballet in hellish conditions. They used long-handled skimmers to remove impurities, ladling the scalding liquid from one cauldron to the next as it grew progressively hotter and thicker. The air was thick with smoke and steam. The floors were slick with sticky molasses. A fall meant a horrific death. Finally, the thickened syrup was taken to the curing house. It was poured into large, conical clay pots. Over weeks, the molasses would slowly drain out through a hole in the bottom, leaving behind the raw, brown muscovado sugar. This was then packed into massive barrels called hogsheads, ready for the perilous sea voyage to the ports of England. This entire violent industrial process was entirely dependent on one input that was not listed on any official schematics: chattel slavery. The machine was designed with the core assumption of a disposable, replaceable, and completely controllable workforce. The human cost was not a regrettable externality. It was a calculated business expense. The workforce was maintained not through incentives, but through a precise calibration of terror. The public flogging, the use of stocks and iron collars, the branding, these were not acts of random sadism. They were management techniques, tools to enforce productivity and suppress dissent. Malnutrition was endemic. The planters allocated the bare minimum of food required to keep a worker functioning. Life was a constant state of hunger and exhaustion. Family itself was a tool of control. The constant threat of having a spouse or child sold away to another plantation was a powerful psychological weapon used to ensure compliance. And then there was the final calculation in this horrific arithmetic. The mortality rate on a sugar plantation was staggering. The combination of overwork, malnutrition, and industrial accidents meant that the enslaved population was not self-sustaining. More people died than were born. And this led to the most chilling economic truth of all. For the planter, sitting in his great house and reviewing his ledger, it was often cheaper to work an enslaved person to death over the course of a few years and simply buy a new one fresh from a slave ship than it was to provide the food, shelter, and medical care necessary to keep them alive into old age. Human beings were not assets to be preserved. They were fuel to be consumed. This is the documented economic horror of Rose Hall, a horror so vast, so systematic, and so rational that a simple ghost story about a wicked witch feels almost like a comforting lie in comparison. Human beings were not assets to be preserved. They were fuel to be consumed. This is the documented economic horror of Rose Hall, a horror so vast, so systematic, and so rational that a simple ghost story about a wicked witch feels almost like a comforting lie in comparison. And this is where we find the central conflict of this entire investigation. It is a battle for the soul of the story. On one side, we have the mountain of evidence detailing the systemic, profit-driven crime of chattel slavery. And on the other, we have the irresistible, seductive, and utterly fictional ghost of Annie Palmer. Why is the real story so completely overshadowed? Why has the sensational folklore not just eclipsed, but practically obliterated the historical reality? The answer is that the truth never stood a chance. It was not a fair fight. The eclipse was a deliberate act, an assassination of history carried out by a master storyteller. We can pinpoint the exact moment the tide turned. The year is 1929. The weapon is a novel, The White Witch of Rose Hall. Its author, Herbert G. DeLissa, was a prominent white Jamaican journalist and writer. He was a man who understood his audience. He knew what kind of story would sell. DeLissa did not invent the idea of a cruel mistress at Rose Hall out of thin air. There were vague, scattered local legends, whispers of a wicked woman. But these were formless, contradictory ghost stories. What DeLissa did was take these fragments of folklore and forge them into a coherent, compelling, and utterly terrifying narrative. He gave the ghost a name, a backstory, and a list of specific lurid crimes. He took the messy clay of rumor and sculpted a perfect monster. His novel was a sensation. It was the Jaws of its day for Jamaican folklore. And in that moment, the central conflict was set. It became a battle between two competing narratives. The narrative of historical fact is complex. It is a story of economics, of trade routes, of agricultural science, of parliamentary acts. Its villains are not individuals, but entire systems. It is a story of thousands of victims, most of them anonymous, their individual lives erased by the ledger book. It is a story that does not offer easy answers or a single person to blame. It is a story that indicts everyone who participated in and benefited from the colonial project. It is, in short, a difficult and deeply uncomfortable truth. The narrative of fiction, on the other hand, is simple. It is a story of personal evil. The villain is a single, beautiful, diabolical woman. Her motives are rooted in passion, black magic, and pure sadism. The victims are her husbands and lovers, characters we can name. The horror is contained within the walls of a single haunted house. It is a story that allows us to be thrilled by the horror without being implicated by it. It is a simple, powerful, and deeply satisfying lie. And in the marketplace of stories, the satisfying lie will almost always defeat the uncomfortable truth. This is the conflict that defines Rose Hall today. The myth created by DeLissa is infinitely more marketable for tourism than a grim lecture on economic history. The ghost tour, with its jump scares and tales of voodoo, is a profitable enterprise. A tour of the sugar works, with a detailed explanation of the mortality rates, is not. So, fiction has decisively won. It has won in the public imagination, it has won in the guidebooks, and it has won on the balance sheets of the companies that now operate the estate. The real history has been eclipsed because the fictional version is easier to sell and far, far easier to swallow. The ghost of Annie Palmer is not just a legend, it is a brand, and a brand is always more powerful than a fact. The ghost of Annie Palmer is not just a legend, it is a brand, and a brand is always more powerful than a fact. But before the brand, there was the business. And like any business built on a finite and morally bankrupt resource, it was destined to fail. The decline of Rose Hall was not the result of a supernatural curse or a slave rebellion. It was the result of a simple, brutal, and inevitable calculation. It was the cold arithmetic of abolition. The first and fatal trigger was the Slavery Abolition Act, passed by the British Parliament in 1833. This single act of law was a death sentence for the entire economic model of Rose Hall. The machine had been built on a single core assumption, a workforce that cost nothing. With a stroke of a pen, that assumption was erased. The British government, in a final, perverse act of justice, did pay compensation, but they did not pay the people who had been enslaved. They paid the masters. The slave owners received millions of pounds for the loss of their property, but this blood money was not a bailout, It was a severance package. It was not enough to save the system. Suddenly, planters had to hire workers. They had to pay wages. They had to compete for labor. The entire financial equation that had made sugar so obscenely profitable was turned on its head. The engine, so long fueled by free human energy, had seized. This triggered the physical decline. Without the vast profits from sugar, the great estates began to crumble. Rose Hall was broken up, its thousands of acres sold off in smaller parcels. The cost of maintaining the great house, that vast fortress of civility, was now prohibitive. It was an architectural dinosaur, a relic of a dead economic era. No longer a symbol of power, it became a liability. The roof began to leak. The jungle, so long held at bay by armies of enslaved gardeners, began to creep back, its vines probing the cracks in the stone. The windows were smashed. The fine mahogany floors rotted away. For over a century, the great house stood as an empty, skeletal ruin, a silent monument to a collapsed world. Other forces sealed its fate. The rise of beet sugar in Europe provided a cheaper, homegrown alternative, breaking the West Indian monopoly. New, more efficient sugar plantations in other parts of the world came online. The golden age was over. The brutal arithmetic was complete. The cost of labor had gone from zero to a significant expense. The value of the product was falling due to global competition. And the primary asset, the land itself, was exhausted and divided. The ledger book, which had for so long shown a story of relentless profit, now told a simple, undeniable story of decay. The machine had finally and permanently broken down. The machine had finally and permanently broken down. For 100 years, the ruin of Rose Hall stood as a silent testament to that collapse, a hollowed-out skull on a hill, picked clean by time and the encroaching jungle. But a place with a story that powerful, even a fictional one, rarely stays dead forever. It was destined for an afterlife. That afterlife began in the 1960s. The jet age had arrived, and Jamaica was being reimagined as a paradise for wealthy American tourists. The ruin of Rose Hall, with its dark romantic legends, was a prime piece of real estate. It was purchased by a former American politician and entrepreneur, John Rollins, and his wife Michelle. They did not see a monument to a crime. They saw a business opportunity. They launched a massive, multi-million-dollar restoration project. The goal was not to create a historically accurate museum. The goal was to create a luxury tourist attraction. The shell of the great house was rebuilt, its interiors lavishly decorated with European antiques and reproduction furniture. Around it, the former cane fields were transformed into a pristine, manicured championship golf course. The landscape of labor was remade into a landscape of leisure. The entire site was reimagined as the centerpiece of a high-end resort. And to sell this new paradise, they needed a story. They reached back and seized upon the most marketable narrative they could find, the legend of the White Witch. The restoration project did not just acknowledge the myth, it leaned into it hard. The novel by Herbert G. de Lisa became their unofficial historical blueprint. The house was rebuilt to be the perfect stage for the ghost story, complete with a recreated dungeon in the basement. The legend became the primary marketing tool, the engine of the new enterprise. And this brings us to the final tragic calculation of loss. What remains today at Rose Hall is a beautiful, but almost entirely conjectural, reconstruction of a great house. It is a fantasy of the colonial past, meticulously curated for the tourist gaze. It is a stunning piece of real estate. But what was lost in this rebirth is almost everything that mattered. What is lost are the specific, individual histories of the thousands of human beings who were the true heart of the Rose Hall story. the restoration erased the last physical traces of their existence. The site of the slave village, where 2,000 people lived their lives, is now covered by the rolling green fairways of a golf course. The location of their burial grounds, where generations were laid to rest, is unknown, unmarked, and unhallowed. The sugar works, the true engine of the estate, were left as a romantic ruin. The names, the faces, the stories, the cultural traditions, the acts of resistance, the moments of joy and sorrow of the enslaved population, all of it has been paved over, literally and figuratively. Their entire world was sacrificed at the altar of a profitable ghost story. The afterlife of Rose Hall is the final, perfect victory of the fiction. It is a place where you can pay to hunt the ghost of a fictional white witch while playing golf on the unmarked graves of her real, forgotten victims. It is a place where you can pay to hunt the ghost of a fictional white witch while playing golf on the unmarked graves of her real, forgotten victims. And this is the final, chilling lesson of Rose Hall. It is the reason this investigation matters far beyond the history of a single house in Jamaica. The lesson is this: history is often more profitable as entertainment than it is as a reckoning. And when profit is on the line, the truth rarely stands a chance. Rose Hall is the perfect case study in how folklore can be deliberately manufactured and then ruthlessly weaponized to sanitize a site of immense human suffering. It is a masterclass in historical money laundering. The process is as cynical as it is brilliant. You take a crime scene, a place of profound and systemic cruelty, and you invent a ghost. You create a simple, supernatural narrative that is thrilling, easy to digest, and, most importantly, absolves everyone of any real complicity. The ghost story allows the visitor, the tourist, to experience a thrill without confronting the uncomfortable truth. It allows them to feel a shiver of fear, to participate in a spooky adventure, without ever having to grapple with the fact that the real horror of this place was not supernatural. It was economic, it was systemic. It was a horror meticulously recorded in account books, justified by Acts of Parliament, and funded by the most respectable banks and investors in London. The legend of the White Witch is a brilliant piece of misdirection. It turns a crime against humanity into a haunted house ride. It encourages you to look for a monster in a silk dress so you don't see the real monster, which is a business model. It is the ultimate triumph of the gift shop over the archive. This brings us to the practical guidance, the core of our work as investigators. How do we fight back against this kind of historical erasure? How do we find the real story when it has been so deliberately and profitably buried? First, you must learn to deliberately ignore the ghost tours. You must treat the official narrative, the ones sold in the brochures and whispered by the tour guides, as an obstacle to be overcome, not as a source of information. You must recognize the marketing materials for what they are, part of the cover-up. Next, you follow the paper trail, no matter how dry or difficult it is. The truth of a place like Rose Hall is not in the folklore. It is in the plantation's business records, if they survive. It is in the cold, hard numbers of the shipping manifests from the port of Montego Bay, which list tons of sugar and rum as impassively as they list the cargo of newly arrived Africans. It is in the furious, detailed reports filed by the abolitionists in Britain, who were the first investigators to document the systemic cruelty of the sugar industry. These are the primary sources. They lack the thrill of a ghost story, but they possess the undeniable power of fact. And finally, you must learn to read the land itself as a document. You must look for the evidence that has been paved over. The real story lies in the archaeological footprint. The faint outlines of the slave village, detectable only through ground-penetrating radar under the 9th fairway of a golf course. The forgotten, unmarked burial grounds, the industrial ruins of the sugar works, which tell a more honest story of daily life and death than the restored ballroom of the great house ever could. To find the truth, you have to follow the ledger, not the ghost. You have to trade the thrill of the legend for the hard, uncomfortable work of the archive. Because the ghosts of Rose Hall are real, but they are not the ones the tour guides want you to see. The real ghosts are the thousands of forgotten people whose names were never recorded, whose lives were consumed by the machine, and whose memory was deliberately sacrificed for the sake of a better story. Our work is to excavate those memories. It is a slow, difficult, and often thankless task. It requires a commitment to digging deeper, to asking the uncomfortable questions, and to challenging the profitable lies that so often pass for history. This is why we do what we do, and it is why we need your help. These deep dives, these forensic investigations into the crimes of the past are not simple. They take time, resources, and a community of supporters who believe that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is worth fighting for. If you believe in this mission, subscribe to this channel. Your support allows us to keep digging. Your likes and comments show that there is a demand for real history, not just convenient fictions. And most importantly, tell us where to dig next. In the comments below, name the monument, the dynasty, the legend that you suspect is hiding a similar crime. What beautiful facade do you think is covering up an ugly truth? Join the investigation, because the past is never dead. It's not even past, and it is waiting for us to uncover it.